The first thing Vane Cordell realized about the planet Orosvel was that his very existence was an insult to the local physics. He stood at the threshold of the harmonic spire, feeling like a smear of grease on a silk sheet. The structure did not have walls in the traditional sense. It had frozen vibrations, translucent membranes of solidified sound that pulsed with a soft, amber luminescence. Every time his heavy combat boots struck the floor, the surface winced. A ripple of indigo light would radiate from his footsteps, a visual sigh of annoyance from a building that was, by all accounts, sentient and extremely judgmental. "Easy there, big guy," Vane muttered to the floor. "I'm just passing through. No need to get your frequencies in a bunch." He adjusted the strap of his pulse rifle, which felt like a primitive club in this cathedral of mathematics. He was dressed in full iron void security gear, matte black plating, scuffed at the edges, smelling faintly of cheap coolant and spent ozone. He looked like a shadow that had refused to leave when the lights came on. A line of erosion sentinels stood flanking the entrance. They were tall, ethereal beings with skin like polished opal and ears that were long, slender filaments capable of catching the music of the stars. Their armor was grown, not forged, a lattice of crystalline humming plates that shifted colors based on their collective mood. Right now, they were a vibrant, prickly shade of violet. "Vane Cordell," he announced, his voice sounding like a rock slide in a library. "Reporting for the High Priority Protection Detail. I've got the site rep right here on my datapad if anyone's interested in actually looking at it." The sentinels didn't move. Their filaments flickered. Vane knew from the briefing that they were communicating on a subaudible level, likely debating whether to let the untuned barbarian inside or simply wait for him to vibrate himself to death. "Look, I'm not here to win a singing contest," Vane growled, his patience thinning. "The Resonance Union signed the contract. I'm the muscle. You're the whatever it is you do. So do we have a green light, or am I going back to the shuttle and billing you for the travel time?" One of the sentinels stepped forward. Its voice was a chord. 3 notes played simultaneously, vibrating in Vane's chest. "You are abrasive, human Cordell. Your internal rhythm is fractured. It causes the spire distress." "Yeah, well, tell the spire to join the club," Vane snapped. "I've got a bad knee and a worse attitude. Now move aside." The sentinel's filaments twitched, and the wall behind it simply dissolved into a mist of gold particles. Vane stepped through, his boots thumping with a dull, rhythmic defiance. The interior was worse. It was a labyrinth of light and acoustics. The spire didn't use stairs. It used gravity-shifting melodies. If you hummed a certain note, you drifted upward. Vane, who couldn't carry a tune if it had handles, had to rely on a mechanical thruster pack that hissed and sputtered, leaving trails of gray smoke against the pristine ceilings. He was supposed to meet the sovereign, the ruler of this vibrating marble, but a movement near a pillar of singing glass caught his eye. A child was watching him. She was small, even by human standards, with the same opalescent skin as the adults. But her filaments were shorter, softer, and currently tangled with curiosity. She was wearing a tunic made of woven light that changed from pale blue to dusty rose as she breathed. Vane stopped. His tactical HUD flickered, identifying the target. Irivan. Primary asset. High value. "Hey, kid," Vane said, trying to dial back the gravel in his voice. "You're not supposed to be lurking in the shadows. It's a security risk." The girl didn't flinch. She walked toward him, her movements silent, unlike his clattering mess of a stride. She stopped 3 feet away and stared at his armor. "You are very loud," she said. Her voice wasn't a chord. It was a single, lonely note. Flat, human-like. "I'm a professional," Vane replied, leaning against a wall that immediately turned cold and gray in protest. "Loud is what I do. Keeps the bad guys from getting any bright ideas." "What is that?" she asked, pointing at a dent in his chest plate. That's a souvenir from a skirmish on Sector 7G. A piece of shrapnel from a mag mine. Nearly punched a hole in my ticker." Erie tilted her head. "It is a broken part of you." "Most parts of me are broken, kid. That's why they hire me. I'm harder to break twice." She reached out, her tiny hand hovering near the scuffed metal. The palace around them began to hum a low, warning frequency. The lights dimmed into a protective crimson. The guards at the far end of the hall began to turn. their weapons, long, tuning fork-like spears, beginning to glow. "Eerie, get back!" a voice commanded from above. Sovereign Alaravin stood on a balcony of solidified sunlight. Her presence was like a symphony of command, her very posture radiating a frequency that forced the air into stillness. She looked down at Vane with an expression that combined clinical observation with deep-seated revulsion. "Human Cordal," the Sovereign said, her voice echoing through the spire. "You were instructed to remain in the intake zone until your frequency was neutralized." "Neutralizing me usually involves a casket, Your Majesty," Vane said, giving a mock salute. "I figured I'd get a head start on the job. The kid seems fine. We were just discussing the merits of getting shot." "She is not a kid," Alaravin said, descending on a platform of sound. "She is the future of the resonance, and you are a discordance we have tolerated only because the void sectors are becoming quiet." Vane sharpened his gaze. "Quiet is bad. Quiet means someone's building a silence bomb. You need a guy who knows how to make noise." Eerie hadn't moved. She was still looking at Vane, her filaments flicking forward. Suddenly, she let out a small, sharp giggle. It was a jagged sound, completely out of sync with the palace's harmony. The Sovereign stiffened. The guards looked horrified. "He looks like a big, grumpy beetle," Irie said. Vane barked a laugh. It was a loud, ugly, wonderful sound that made the walls of the palace ripple in frantic zigzags. "A beetle? That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in 3 light years. Watch out, kid, or I'll start acting like one." For a moment, the tension in the room shifted. The Sovereign looked at her daughter, then at the scarred, dusty soldier. The palace lights flickered between violet and gold, undecided on how to react to this strange new frequency. "Remain with her then," Ilaravin said, her voice dropping to a somber tone. "But if you break the silence of this sanctuary, Cordell, the spire will not be the only thing that judges you." Vane looked down at Eerie, who was now poking at his mag pouch. "Don't worry, Your Highness," Vane muttered. "I'm used to being the guy who ruins the party." By the 3rd day of his assignment, Vane Cordell had successfully offended 5 statues, 2 sentient fountains, and the entire east wing of the royal gardens. It turned out that the plants on Orosvel grew better if you hummed to them. Vane had tried whistling a tune from an old earth bar, and the flowers had shriveled into tiny black balls of resentment. "Told you," Vane said to Irie, who was sitting on a floating moss pad nearby. "I'm a botanical disaster. You should see what I do to plastic ferns." "The flowers like the C-sharp," Irie explained, her eyes tracking the way Vane's armor caught the midday light. "You are playing Z-. Is that a real note? Because I feel like I just invented it." He was sitting on the edge of a crystal fountain, his legs stretched out. He had taken his helmet off, revealing a face mapped by scars and a jawline that hadn't seen a razor in 48 hours. He was cleaning his pulse rifle, the metallic click-clack of the components echoing through the tranquil garden like a series of small explosions. "Why do you keep touching the metal thing?" Irie asked. "It's a habit. In the void, if your gear isn't clean, you're dead weight. It's called maintenance. You take care of the tool takes care of you." "Is it your friend?" Vane paused, a cleaning rag mid-swipe. He looked at the weapon, a cold, heavy piece of engineering designed for one purpose: to stop a heart from beating. "No, kid, it's not a friend. It's a necessity. There's a difference. Friends are people who stay when the shooting stops. This thing, it only stays because I'm holding it." Eerie hopped off her moss pad and walked over. The ground beneath her feet made a soft, melodic chime with every step. She stood between his knees and looked at the rifle. "My mother says that weapons are the language of the untuned. She says they are for those who cannot hear the harmony." "Your mother is a very smart lady," Vane said, his voice unusually soft. "But harmony doesn't stop a kinetic slug traveling at 3,000 meters per second. Sometimes the only way to protect a song is to be the wall it hides behind." "Are you a wall?" Vane looked at her, this tiny, fragile creature who lived in a world of glass and music, yet seemed so fascinated by his grime and steel. "I'm trying to be, but walls get hit a lot, Irie. It's not a fun job." "I like the sound your boots make," she whispered, leaning in closer. "They are like Heartbeats. Thump, thump, thump. The palace is too smooth. It never stops. It's like a song that has no end, and I get tired of listening. Vane felt a strange tightening in his chest. He recognized that look. It was the look of a soldier who had been on the front lines for too long without a rotation, the fatigue of perfection. "Tell me a story," she commanded, grabbing his forearm. Her fingers were cool against his skin. "Not a song, a story from the dirt world." Vane sighed, leaning back. "A story, huh? All right. Once on a planet called Earth, there were these things called dogs. They didn't have crystal skin or ear filaments. They were covered in fur. They smelled like wet grass, and they spent most of their time chasing things that didn't want to be caught." "Did they sing?" "God, no, they barked. It was a loud, annoying, beautiful sound. And if they liked you, they'd wag their tails so hard they'd knock over the furniture. They didn't care about harmony. They just cared that you were there." Erie's eyes widened. "I want a dog. Can we get a dog?" "I don't think the Spire would appreciate a golden retriever peeing on the sacred crystals, kid. We'd be KIA in 10 minutes. "What is KIA? Killed in action, military slang, means you didn't make it to the after party." Erie frowned. "I do not want to be KIA. I want to be LIA. LIA? Living in action," she said with a sudden, brilliant smile. Vane laughed, a genuine, chest-shaking sound that caused the fountain behind him to spray water in a chaotic, jagged pattern. "LIA. I like that. We'll make a soldier out of you yet." The moment was shattered by a sudden, jarring shift in the atmosphere. The sky above Oros Vel, usually a pale lavender, turned a bruised, sickly gray. The ground beneath them didn't chime, it groaned. A low-frequency vibration started in the distance, so deep it made Vane's teeth ache. Vane was on his feet in a second. His rifle was assembled and hot-loaded before Irie could even blink. He didn't think. He reacted. He scooped the girl up with one arm, tucking her against his hip, and stepped back toward the reinforced archway of the spire. "Sit rep," he barked into his comms, but all he got was static, a cold, dead silence that was far more terrifying than any noise. "Vane?" Irie asked, her filaments trembling. "The palace. It's crying." "Stay quiet," Vane whispered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Something's coming, kid, and it's not bringing a choir." From the shadows of the crystalline trees, shapes began to emerge. They were hooded, draped in heavy fabrics that absorbed all light. They carried long, black canisters that emitted a visible ripple of distorted air. "Silencers," Vane hissed. "They're not here to talk." He felt the girl's heart racing against his side. The sovereign's voice boomed through the palace's internal resonance, but it was fading, cracking like a record being played too slow. "Cordell, protect the asset. The resonance is falling." Vane tightened his grip on Erie. He looked at the invaders, then at the girl. "All right, LIA, Vane muttered, clicking the safety off his rifle. "Time to see if this beetle can bite." He didn't head for the palace's main defense points. He knew the protocol. It involved retreating to the harmony chambers and praying for the frequencies to stabilize. That was a death trap. Instead, he turned and ran toward the service tunnels, the dark, untuned veins of the spire, where the dirt and the machinery lived. "Where are we going?" Irie cried over the rising howl of the silence bombs. "To the one place they won't look for a princess," Vane said, his boots slamming into the ground with enough force to crack the crystal. "We're going to the basement, and we're going to be as loud as we damn well please." As they disappeared into the dark, the first of the silencers reached the garden. They found only a dented cleaning rag and the echoes of a heartbeat that refused to fade. The sublevels of the harmonic spire were a graveyard of abandoned frequencies. Here, far beneath the shimmering galleries and the singing gardens, the architecture was different. It was denser, more utilitarian, and smelled of ancient ozone and damp earth. This was the foundation of the world, where the original settlers had carved out a space before they learned how to persuade the crystals to grow into art. Vane Cordell moved through the dim corridors with the grace of a predatory animal that had spent too long in a cage. He held Erie against his chest with his left arm, his right hand gripping the pulse rifle as if it were an extension of his own nervous system. The girl was silent, her filaments tucked tight against her skull. She could feel the vibration of Vane's heartbeat through his armor, a steady rhythmic thrum that didn't change even as the ceiling above them groaned under the weight of the silence bombs. "We are in the throat of the spire," Eerie whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical hiss of Vane's leg servos. "It feels cold, like a song that was forgotten halfway through." "It's called the basement, kid," Vane grunted, his eyes darting between the shadows. "And forgotten is good. Forgotten means nobody is looking for us down here." He stopped at a junction where 3 tunnels converged. His tactical display was a mess of scrolling red errors. The anti-resonance weapons the invaders were using had scrambled the spire's internal GPS. To the Erosians, this was a catastrophe. They navigated by the harmony of the walls. Without it, they were blind. But Vane was a creature of the dark, trained to find his way by the smell of stagnant air and the subtle shift of shadows. "Hold on tight," Vane said. "We're taking the ventilation shaft. It's a tight squeeze, and it's going to be dusty as hell." "What is hell?" Irie asked, her voice trembling slightly. Vane paused, his thumb hovering over the release catch for a maintenance hatch. "A place where the coffee is always cold and you never get to sleep. Trust me, you don't want to go there." He kicked the hatch open. The sound was a sharp, metallic clang that echoed for miles in the silence. Vane winced. In the upper levels, that sound would have triggered a symphony of alarms. Here it just hung in the air like a bad memory. He slid into the shaft, his armor scraping against the rough-hewn crystal walls. The space was barely 2 meters wide, forcing him to hunch his shoulders and move in a low, agonizing crouch. His knee chose that moment to flare up. A sharp, white-hot needle of pain shot from his patella up into his hip. Vane hissed through his teeth, his grip on Irie tightening for a fraction of a second. "You are hurt," she said, reaching out to touch the dented plating on his thigh. "The metal is screaming." "It's just a protest, kid," Vane said, his voice strained. "My body and I have been at war for 20 years. Neither of us is winning." He pushed forward, dragging his leg behind him. Every 30 meters, he stopped to listen. The silence bombs were doing more than just killing the sound. They were eating the structure. He could feel the micro-fractures forming in the walls, the crystal losing its cohesion. Oros Vel was a world built on a song, and the invaders were tearing out the lyrics. Suddenly, Vane froze. His HUD picked up a heat signature 50 meters ahead, around a bend in the shaft. It was small, cold, and moving, with a terrifying mechanical precision. "Static heads," Vane whispered. "What are they?" Irie asked. Vane eased her down into a small alcove in the ventilation duct. He didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the corner ahead. Silencers. Mercenaries from the outer rim. They use dampening fields to mask their presence. They're professional ghosts. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't even breathe loud enough for the dust to hear you." "Vane," she said, her filaments twitching. "I am scared." "I know, kid," he said, and for a fleeting second, his voice lost its gravel. "Fear is just your body's way of telling you that you're still alive. Keep that fear close. It'll keep you sharp." Vane moved forward, his heavy boots making no sound on the dusty floor. He had adjusted his gait, rolling his weight from heel to toe, a trick he'd learned in the jungles of Sector 9. He rounded the corner and saw the intruder. It was a tall, spindly figure, draped in a matte black cloak that seemed to swallow the light. The silencer was holding a sonic disruptor, scanning the walls for the girl's unique resonance. Vane didn't call out. He didn't offer a chance to surrender. In the void, mercy was just a slow way to get killed. He lunged. The silencer reacted with unnatural speed, spinning around and raising the disruptor, but Vane was already inside its guard. He slammed the butt of his rifle into the assassin's helmet, the sound of cracking composite filling the narrow space. The silencer tried to draw a vibroblade, but Vane caught the wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped with a wet, sickening pop. The assassin didn't scream. They didn't have voices. They were surgically altered to be silent. Vane slammed the silencer against the wall, his armored forearm crushing the windpipe. He looked into the dark visor of the helmet and saw his own reflection. A tired, scarred man with eyes that had seen too many sunsets over burning cities. "Wrong house, pal," Vane growled. He triggered the point-blank discharge on his pulse rifle. A burst of blue energy hammered into the silencer's chest, vaporizing the cloak and the armor beneath it. The body slumped to the floor, a smoking ruin of flesh and tech. Vane stood over the corpse for a moment, his chest heaving. His knee was throbbing now, a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the flickering lights of the shaft. He checked his ammo count. 20 rounds left. Not enough for a war, just enough for a funeral. He walked back to the alcove and found Irie curled into a ball, her hands over her ears. When she saw him, she didn't look at the smoke or the weapon. She looked at his hands. They were shaking. "Is it gone?" she asked. "Yeah," Vane said, holstering his rifle. "It's zeroed out. Let's move. We're about 4 kilometers from the core. If we can get there, I can tap into the emergency broadcast system and call for a shuttle." Irie stood up, her filaments slowly unfolding. "You killed it." "I stopped it," Vane corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Vane didn't answer. He couldn't. He picked her up again, feeling the weight of her trust like a physical pressure on his spine. He had spent his whole life breaking things, destroying rhythms, causing discord. He had been a soldier of fortune, a gun for hire, a man who belonged nowhere. But as he looked at the girl, he realized that for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to stay. The tunnels became tighter as they descended. The air grew thick with the smell of scorched crystal. Vane's HUD was flickering in and out of existence, but he didn't need it anymore. He could feel the heart of the planet beating somewhere below them, a deep, resonant hum that even the silence bombs couldn't reach. "We're close," he whispered. "Just a little further, kid." But as they rounded the final corner into the core chamber, Vane stopped dead. The massive, crystalline heart of Oros Vel was not glowing with its usual gold light. It was gray. It was dying. And standing in front of it was Sovereign Alaravan, her armor shattered, her filaments broken, facing a dozen silencers who were preparing to finish the job. Vane felt Irie's grip tighten on his shoulder. "Mommy," she whimpered. Vane took a deep breath, his finger ghosting over the trigger. "Well," he muttered to himself, "I guess we're doing this the hard way." The core chamber was an architectural marvel that had been turned into a slaughterhouse. Great pillars of resonance glass, each one tuned to a specific frequency of the erosion history, had been shattered into millions of jagged shards. They carpeted the floor like frozen tears, crunching beneath the heavy boots of the silencers. Sovereign Alaravan stood at the base of the Great Heart, her skin pale and translucent, blood the color of liquid silver weeping from a wound in her shoulder. She was holding a ceremonial staff, but it was dim, its power drained by the dampening fields that filled the room like a physical fog. The 12 silencers moved in a slow, calculated semicircle. Their disruptors hummed with a low, predatory growl. They were waiting for the Sovereign to falter, for the last of her internal rhythm to fail. Vane leaned back into the shadows of the entrance tunnel, his mind racing. A dozen professional killers, high ground, and a dampening field that would make his pulse rifle as effective as a wet firework. The odds were foobar. "Stay here," Vane whispered to Irie, setting her down behind a pile of rubble. "If things go south, I want you to run back into the ventilation shafts. Don't look back. Don't stop until you see the stars." Irie grabbed his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "You are going to do something brave." Vane gave a short, bitter laugh. "No, kid. I'm going to do something stupid. There's a fine line between the high and the hero, and I usually trip over it." He checked his belt. 2 flashbangs, 1 EMP grenade, and a combat knife that had seen better days. He reached into his mag pouch and pulled out a small silver cylinder, a sonic suture he'd pinched from the med bay on the first day. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "If I don't come back, use it on your mother. It won't fix everything, but it'll stop the bleeding." "Vane," she said, her voice catching, "you are my friend." Vane froze. The word hit him harder than the silencer's kick. He hadn't been anyone's friend in a long time. He was a tool, an asset, a liability. But a friend? "Yeah," Vane said, his voice cracking, "and you're the best boss I've ever had. Now stay frosty." Vane didn't charge in. He was a merc, not a martyr. He pulled the pin on the EMP grenade, and cooked it for 2 seconds before tossing it into the center of the silencer formation. The explosion was silent, a ripple of blue distortion that tore through the dampening fields and short-circuited the silencer's visors. For a heartbeat, the assassins were blind, their high-tech sensors screaming in agony. Vane moved. He wasn't a blur of motion. He was a freight train. He burst from the shadows, his rifle barked as he picked off the two nearest silencers with precision headshots. He didn't wait to see them fall. He transitioned to his combat knife, driving the blade through the neck seal of a third attacker before they could even draw their sidearm. The room erupted into chaos. The silencers, recovered from the initial shock, began to return fire, but they were used to fighting Arashans who move with grace and predictability. Vane Cordell was neither of those things. He used the shattered crystal pillars as cover, sliding through the debris, his armor taking hits that would have vaporized a lesser man. He reached the Sovereign just as a silencer was raising a disruptor to her head. Vane tackled the assassin, the two of them crashing into the base of the Great Heart. They grappled on the floor, a mess of black cloaks and scarred metal. The silencer was strong, their movements enhanced by subdermal servos, but Vane had something they didn't: desperation. He jammed his thumb into the assassin's eye socket and twisted, then finished the job with a brutal snap of the neck. He rolled off the body and looked up at Alaravan. She was staring at him with a mixture of awe and terror. "The human," she whispered, her voice a fragile melody. "You came back." "I'm on the clock, remember?" Vane said, his voice a jagged rasp. He grabbed her arm and pulled her behind the curve of the Great Heart. "Where's the override for the broadcast system? I need to get a signal out to the orbital platform." "It is there." She pointed to a console made of swirling light that was currently flickering between amber and black. "But it requires a harmonic key." My voice is too weak. Vane looked at the console, then at the 5 remaining silencers who were closing in. They were moving more cautiously now, their disruptors focused on his position. He was pinned down, his ammo was dry, and his armor was failing. "Eerie!" Vane shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Get over here!" The girl scrambled out from the rubble, dodging a stray burst of sonic energy. She reached them, her face streaked with dust and tears. "Can you sing for this thing?" Vane asked, gesturing to the console. Irie looked at the swirling light. I am out of tune, Vane. You know this. I cannot find the harmony." "Listen to me, Irie," Vane said, grabbing her by the shoulders. He ignored the stinging pain in his side where a disruptor bolt had grazed him. "The palace is dying. Your mother is dying, and I'm about 5 minutes away from becoming a very expensive paperweight. I don't need you to find the harmony. I need you to find your own note." "But it will be ugly," she cried. "Good," Vane yelled. "Ugly is what we need right now. The silencers, the dampening fields, they're all built to counter perfection. They don't know what to do with ugly. They don't know what to do with us." He stood up, exposing himself to draw the attacker's fire. He pulled his sidearm, a small, snub-nosed kinetic pistol, and began to lay down suppressive fire. It was a loud, crude weapon, its bang, 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 a rhythmic insult to the silence of the chamber. "Do it, Irie. Sing the loudest, ugliest note you've got." Irie looked at her mother, who was watching her with wide, wet eyes. Then she looked at Vane, the man who smelled like smoke, and told stories about barking dogs. She stepped up to the console, took a deep breath, and let out a sound that Oros Vel had never heard in its 1,000-year history. It wasn't a song. It was a scream. It was a jagged, discordant wail of grief, fear, and stubborn, defiant hope. It was the sound of a child who refused to be quiet in the face of the dark. The console reacted instantly. The light didn't swirl. It exploded. A wave of raw, unfiltered resonance radiated outward from the Great Heart. It wasn't the soft gold of the old days. It was a fierce, burning white. The silencers were caught in the blast. Their dampening fields shattered like glass. Their sensors overloaded. Their visors shattered, and they were thrown backward across the room, their internal systems fried by the sheer audacity of the sound. The broadcast system flared to life. A massive beam of energy shot upward through the spire, piercing the gray clouds of Oros Vel and reaching out into the stars. "Sit rep!" Vane shouted into his comms, which were finally clear of static. This is Cordell. We have the asset and the sovereign. The core is secured. I need an immediate extraction at the following coordinates. Move it, people. He slumped against the great heart, his legs finally giving out. He felt the cold crystal against his back, and for the first time in 3 days, he felt the floor beneath him stop complaining. The palace was no longer judging him. It was holding him. Irie fell to her knees beside him, her chest heaving. Was that okay? She asked, her voice trembling. Kid, Vane said, closing his eyes. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Sovereign Ilaravin crawled over to them, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch her daughter's face. She looked at Vane, and for a long moment there was no royalty, no protocol, no high-priority contract. There was only a mother who had almost lost everything. You chose her, the Sovereign said quietly. Vane looked at the blood on his hands, then at the girl who was now leaning her head against his shoulder. He thought about the men he had lost in the void, the friends he hadn't been able to save, the choices he had made for credits and glory. I think she chose me first, Vane said, and in my line of work, you don't walk away from a good contract. The sound of atmospheric thrusters began to rumble in the distance. The rescue team was coming. The war wasn't over, but for a moment, in the ruins of the world's heart, there was a different kind of harmony. It wasn't perfect. It was scarred, dusty, and loud. It was family. Vane reached out and squeezed Irie's hand. We're going to get you that dog, kid, he muttered, even if I have to build the damn thing myself. Irie smiled, her filaments finally glowing with a soft, steady gold. I would like that, Vane. I would like that very much. As the shuttle bay doors opened above them, bathing the chambers in the harsh, artificial light of the rescue craft, Vane Cordell realized that the weight on his chest wasn't just armor and exhaustion. It was the knowledge that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to leave. He had spent his whole life looking for a fight he could win, but he had found something better. He had found a reason to stay. Is it over? Irie asked, shielding her eyes from the light. No, Vane said, his voice firm as he stood up, his knee locked in place by sheer will. It's just starting, but this time, we're keeping the volume turned up. The infirmary of the Harmonic Spire was not a room of beds and bandages, but a cathedral of liquid light in suspension fields. Vane Cordell was currently suspended 3 meters above a pool of shimmering, turquoise resonance fluid, held in place by a series of invisible sonic webs. His armor had been stripped away, leaving him in his sweat-stained undersuit, his scarred skin exposed to the relentless, clinical gaze of the Erosian healers. They moved around him like ghosts, their filaments glowing with a sterile, pale blue light as they hummed a low-frequency repair shanty. The sonic suture was working on his knee. He could feel the microscopic vibrations of the resonance fluid as it forced his torn ligaments to realign, weaving the tissue back together with the precision of a high-end fabricator. It felt like 10,000 tiny needles were dancing under his skin, a prickly, annoying sensation that made him want to punch the nearest wall. Can we turn the volume down on this? Vane gritted his teeth, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. It feels like I'm being eaten by a swarm of electric gnats. One of the healers, an elder with filaments that had turned the color of frosted glass, tilted their head. Your discordance is deep, human Cordell. Your marrow carries the echoes of 100 battlefields. The fluid is merely cleansing the static. Static is what keeps me upright, pal, Vane retorted, though his bravado was dampened by the way his vision blurred every time the healers hit a particularly sharp high note. Just patch the leak and let me down. I've got a perimeter to check. Your duty is concluded for the cycle, a new voice intervened. Vane looked toward the entrance. Sovereign Ilaravin stood there, her own wounds already sealed by the palace's superior tech, though she looked diminished. Her movements were stiff, her presence lacking its usual orchestral weight. Behind her walked a man Vane hadn't seen before, a tall, severe Erosian with robes made of heavy, obsidian-like crystal. He carried himself with a terrifying, silent authority, his filaments held in a rigid, vertical position that felt like a slap in the face. This is High Cantor Malveth, the Sovereign said, her voice strained. He is the guardian of the primal song. He has come to evaluate the events in the core. Vane didn't like the look of the cantor. The man didn't look like a healer or a ruler. He looked like an auditor. He looked like the kind of guy who would fire a whole platoon for having scuffed boots. Evaluating, huh? Vane said, the suspension field finally lowering him to the floor. He stumbled as his boots hit the ground, his newly repaired knee feeling disturbingly smooth, like it didn't belong to him. If you're looking for a thank you, I'll take it in credits. If you're looking for a report, the kid screamed, the bad guys went pop, and I'm the guy who didn't die. The high cantor stepped forward, his eyes scanning Vane with a cold, analytical intensity that made the soldier's skin crawl. You used a child of the royal blood as a resonator for raw discordance. You allowed her to voice a scream that has fractured the architectural integrity of 3 sectors. Vane felt his jaw tighten. I used the only weapon we had left, and in case you missed the sit rep, it worked. If I hadn't pushed her to find that note, you'd be whistling a different tune in a silencer labor camp. The sovereign raised a hand, her filaments flickering with a weary golden light. Enough, cantor. The human saved my life. He saved Irie. He saved her flesh, Alaravin, but at what cost to her spirit? Malveth's voice was a deep, resonating baritone that seemed to vibrate the very air in Vane's lungs. She is the heir to the harmonic spire. Her life must be a perfect melody. Now she is stained. She speaks of dogs and dirt worlds. She mimics the abrasive cadence of this barbarian. She is drifting out of tune. Vane took a step toward the cantor, ignoring the warning hum from the healers. She's 7 years old, you clank. She's allowed to be out of tune. She just survived an assassination attempt. Maybe she doesn't want to be a perfect melody right now. Maybe she just wants to be a kid. She is Oros Vel, the cantor replied, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. She is the spire. If she remains discordant, the spire will reject her. The world will reject her. Ilaravin looked away, her posture crumbling. The cantor is right, Cordal. The spire is reacting. The lights in the upper galleries are dimming. The walls are growing cold. The palace is a living entity, and it does not recognize the child's new frequency. It sees her as a flaw, a sickness. Vane looked between the 2 rulers, a cold, sinking feeling taking hold of his stomach. What are you saying? She must be harmonized, Malveth said. We will take her to the Vault of Echoes. We will immerse her in the primal song until the discordance is washed away. She will return to the purity she once possessed. You mean you're going to brainwash her? Vane growled, his hand moving instinctively to where his pistol should have been. You're going to wipe out everything that makes her, her. The laughter, the stories, the way she looks at the stars. You're going to turn her back into a porcelain doll that doesn't talk back. She will be perfect, the cantor insisted. Vane looked at Alaravin, hoping for a spark of motherly defiance. Your Highness, don't do this. She's finally starting to breathe. She's not shaking anymore. She's not hiding behind pillars. If you put her in that vault, you're killing the daughter I just saved. The sovereign's eyes were full of a terrible ancient sorrow. If I do not, the palace will fail. Thousands of our people live within these walls. If the harmony is lost, the spire will collapse. My choice is between the heart of my daughter and the lives of my people. Vane felt a surge of pure, unadulterated anger. It was a familiar heat, the kind that usually preceded a very loud and very violent encounter. That's the problem with you perfect types. You're so worried about the big song that you forget the individual notes. You're treating her like a faulty circuit board. Your contract is fulfilled, Cordal, Ilaravin said, her voice barely a whisper. The iron void has been paid in full. There is a shuttle waiting at the tertiary port. Take your credits and go. Forget this world. Forget the girl. Vane stood in the center of the shimmering infirmary, the silence of the room pressing in on him like a physical weight. He could feel the credits in his digital account, enough to buy his way onto a luxury liner to the core systems, enough to spend the rest of his life in a drunken haze on a beach somewhere, far away from the sound of screaming and the smell of ozone. He could walk away. He could bug out. That was the smart move. That was the merc move. But then he remembered Erie's hand in his. He remembered her saying he was her friend. He remembered the way she'd looked at him when she realized they were LIA, living in action. Vane looked the high canner in the eye. "I don't like your face, pal, and I really don't like your music." He turned and walked out of the infirmary, his new knee clicking with a rhythmic, mechanical defiance that echoed through the hall. He didn't head for the port. He headed for the royal quarters. He found Iris sitting in the middle of her sleeping chamber, surrounded by a dozen floating light spheres that were supposed to be humming a lullaby. Instead, they were making a dull, static-filled sound that made the girl look small and lonely. "Vane," she said, standing up. "Mommy says I have to go to the vault. She says I'm broken." Vane knelt in front of her, his armorless chest feeling strangely vulnerable. "You're not broken, Irie. You're just playing a different song now, and some people are too old and too grumpy to learn the lyrics." "Am I going to forget you?" she asked, her filaments drooping. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Vane said, reaching out and tapping the silver sonic suture she was still holding. "Remember what I told you? Maintenance. You take care of the tool takes care of you. You're the most important tool in this whole damn galaxy, Irie. And I'm not letting anyone reset your settings." "How?" she whispered. Vane looked at the walls. They were pulsing with a deep, angry violet light. The spire was watching him. It was judging him. "We're going to make some noise, kid," Vane said, a dark, dangerous grin spreading across his face. "We're going to make so much noise that they'll have to listen." But as he stood up to lead her toward the service elevators, the door hissed open. It wasn't the guards. It wasn't the cantor. It was a silencer. The assassin was already mid-lunge, a vibroblade humming with a deadly, high-pitched whine. Vane didn't have his rifle. He didn't have his armor. He didn't hesitate. He caught the assassin's wrist in midair, the force of the impact vibrating through his newly healed knee. He slammed his forehead into the silencer's visor, the world exploding in a flash of white light. He felt a sharp, burning pain in his side as the vibroblade grazed his ribs, but he didn't let go. "Go!" Vane roared at Irie. "Run to the vents!" Irie didn't run. She stood her ground, her eyes wide, her filaments glowing with a fierce, unstable white light. "No!" she screamed. "No more silence!" The room didn't just vibrate, it buckled. The light spheres exploded into 1,000 shards of radiance. The silencer was thrown backward as if hit by a physical wall of sound, slamming into the far wall and sliding down in a heap of broken tech. Vane slumped to the floor, clutching his side. His hand came away red. "See?" he gasped, trying to find his breath. "Told you, you were a heavy hitter." Irie ran to him, her hands glowing with the same white light. "You are KIA, she cried. "You are KIA. "Not yet, kid," Vane said, his vision beginning to dim at the edges. "Not until the after-party." But as the palace alarms began to scream a discordant, panicked symphony, Vane realized that the silencers weren't the only ones coming for them. The spire was closing in. The walls were narrowing. The architecture of Orosvel had finally decided that the discordants had to be purged. And they were the virus. The air in the service tunnels was screaming. It wasn't a sound of air movement or mechanical failure, but the literal voice of the spire as its structural harmonics began to tear themselves apart. The amber and gold lights of the upper galleries had been replaced by a flickering, jagged crimson that pulsed like a dying heart. Every 5 minutes, the walls would lurch 3 meters to the left or right, the living crystal attempting to reconfigure itself into a shape that could contain the chaos. Vane Cordell was fading. He had managed to patch the vibroblade wound in his side with a strip of his undersuit and a prayer, but the loss of blood was making the world feel like it was made of wool. He was leaning heavily on Irie, his arm draped over her small shoulders, his boots dragging through the dust of the lower levels. We're bugging out, kid," Vane muttered, his voice a ghost of its former self. "Just gotta get to the secondary hangar. I've got a transponder in my boot. I can call in a heavy lifter." "You need a healer, Vane," Irie said, her voice steady and calm in a way that terrified him. The white light hadn't left her eyes. She moved through the twisting corridors with a terrifying certainty, as if she could see the geometry of the spire's collapse before it happened. "I need a drink and a nap," Vane countered, though his knees buckled as the floor beneath them suddenly turned into a steep incline. "Whoa, The palace is definitely having an existential crisis. The spire is trying to find the end of the song, Eerie said, her filaments twitching. It thinks that if it stops moving, the pain will stop. But there is no end. There is only the next note. Vane looked at her. The 7-year-old child he'd met 3 days ago was gone. In her place was something ancient and strange, a bridge between the old harmony and the new discord. She wasn't just Irie anymore. She was the avatar of a world in transition, and that was exactly why they were being hunted. They reached a wide circular junction that served as the primary nexus for the spire's environmental systems. Huge rotating turbines of crystal hummed with a deep, subaudible frequency, moving the air and the water through the palace's circulatory system. In the center of the room stood High Cantor Malveth, flanked by a dozen Erosian sentinels in full resonance armor. They weren't carrying tuning forks this time. They were carrying heavy-duty sonic cannons, the kind used for clearing asteroid belts. "Step away from the child, Cordell," the Cantor commanded. His voice was no longer a baritone. It was a thunderous roar that echoed off the turbines. "You have led her into the abyss of the untuned. You have turned the future of our world into a weapon of destruction." "She's a little girl, Malveth," Vane shouted back, though it felt like his lungs were full of glass. "Look at her! She's not a weapon. She's just scared." "She is not scared," the Cantor replied, gesturing to the flickering white light in Eerie's eyes. "She is a resonance flare. If she is not contained within the vault, she will continue to broadcast this discord until the entire planet is shattered. Oros Vel will become a graveyard of dust." "Then move the people," Vane yelled. "If the building can't handle the new music, build a new building. Don't kill the kid just because she's too loud for your taste." "We are the building, Cordell," one of the sentinels said, their filaments glowing with a cold, unforgiving blue. "We are the song. To change the song is to cease to exist." The sentinels began to move in, their cannons humming as they charged. Vane felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but his body wouldn't respond. He tried to raise his hand to reach for a weapon he didn't have, but his muscles felt like water. Irie stepped forward. She let go of Vane and stood in the center of the junction, her small shadow stretching long across the vibrating floor. "You want the song?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried over the roar of the turbines like a silver bell. "Eerie, no," Vane whispered. "You want the song back?" she repeated, her eyes locking onto the High Cantors. "I will give it to you. I will give you all of it." She took a breath. It was a long, deep pull of air that seemed to suck the very resonance out of the room. The turbines slowed, the lights flickered and died. The only thing left in the darkness was the girl, and then she sang. It wasn't a scream this time. It wasn't discord. It was a melody that defied every law of Erosian physics. It was a song that carried the weight of the Earth's dirt, the smell of the dog's fur, the heat of the magmines, and the cold silence of the void. It was a human song played on an alien instrument. It was the story of Vane Cordell, the man who had stayed when he should have run. The High Cantor froze. The sentinels lowered their cannons. The spire itself seemed to hold its breath. The walls of the junction didn't crack. They didn't buckle. They began to change. The rigid crystalline structures softened, turning into a material that looked like liquid mercury. The amber light returned, but it wasn't the sterile glow of the past. It was a warm, flickering orange, like a campfire in the middle of a dark forest. The spire wasn't rejecting the discordance anymore. It was absorbing it. It was learning. Eerie's song continued, rising in volume until it filled the entire nexus. The white light in her eyes faded, replaced by a deep, soulful gold. She reached out her hands and the turbines began to spin again. But their hum was different now. It was a steady, rhythmic beat. Thump, thump, thump. The heartbeat of a soldier. The High Cantor fell to his knees, his obsidian robes shattering as the floor beneath him vibrated with the new frequency. "My God," he whispered, his filaments trembling. It is the second movement." Eerie stopped singing. The silence that followed was not the cold, dead silence of the silencers, but the peaceful, expectant silence of a world that had just woken up from a very long sleep. She walked back to Vane and knelt beside him. She placed her hands on his side and he felt a warmth spread through his body. A resonance that didn't just stitch his skin, but healed the static in his very soul. "We are LIA, Vane," she whispered. "Yeah," Vane coughed, his vision finally clearing. We definitely are." The High Cantor stood up slowly, his face no longer severe, but ancient and tired. He looked at the girl, then at the human who had taught her how to scream. He didn't order the sentinels to fire. He didn't call for the vault. "The spire has accepted the new note," Malveth said, his voice a humble murmur. "The foundation has shifted. We cannot go back to the old harmony. We must learn to play this new music." He looked at Vane. "You have done more than protect a princess, human Cordal. You have altered the evolution of a species. You have brought the dirt to the stars." Vane managed to sit up, leaning against a pillar that now felt as warm as a sun-baked rock. "Does this mean I get a raise?" Ilaravin appeared in the doorway of the Nexus, her face wet with tears. She didn't look at the Cantor or the Sentinels. She ran to her daughter and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into Erie's hair. "I'm so sorry. I forgot that I was a mother before I was a sovereign." Erie held her mother, but her eyes were still on Vane. "He stayed, Mommy. He stayed when the palace told him to go." The sovereign looked at Vane, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of true understanding in her gaze. "You were never just a sign, Vane Cordell. You were a choice." Vane looked at the three of them, the mother, the child, and the broken world they shared. He thought about the shuttle waiting at the port, the credits in his account, and the empty life he had been so eager to return to. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. "Well," Vane said, pulling himself to his feet with the help of the newly warm wall, "since the palace is undergoing renovations, you're probably going to need someone to keep the contractors in line. I'm expensive, I'm loud, and I've got a very low tolerance for bad music." Ilaravin smiled, a genuine, beautiful melody. "We wouldn't have it any other way." As they walked out of the Nexus together, the spire began to sing a new song, a song of heavy boots, of barking dogs, and of the family that is chosen in the heart of the storm. Vane Cordal felt the rhythm of Oros Vel settle into his bones, and for the first time in 38 years, he didn't feel like a discordance. He felt like a harmony. But as they reached the upper levels, a new signal flared on Vane's HUD. It wasn't an Orosian frequency. It was a high-priority encrypted transmission from the Iron Void. Contract update, extraction denied. Target priority shifted. Eliminate the asset. Silence the spire. Vane looked at Erie, who was laughing as she watched a fountain dance to the beat of her new heart. The war wasn't over. The mercs were coming back. And this time, they weren't just bringing silence bombs. They were bringing the company. Vane gripped his side, the warmth of Irie's healing still humming in his blood. "Fine," he thought. "Let them come. I've finally found something worth making a noise for." He looked at the sovereign. "Hey, Alara, how do you feel about upgrading the palace's security to include 500 heavy-duty railguns?" She laughed, the sound echoing through the shifting crystal. "I think the spire would find that very resonant." Vane nodded, a grim satisfaction settling into his chest. "Good. Because if they want to silence this song, they're going to have to go through the drummer first." The credits didn't matter anymore. The contract was void. He wasn't a mercenary, he was a father. And in the language of the void, that meant he was never going to let go. The light of Oros Vel turned a defiant, burning orange as the first of the Iron Void dropships entered the atmosphere, 30 kilometers away and closing fast. "Sit, Rep," Vane whispered to the living walls. "We're going to need a lot more than C-sharp." The walls pulsed in response, a deep, vibrating thrum that felt like a promise. "We are ready," the spire seemed to say. The sky above Oros Vel had ceased to be a canvas of lavender and gold. It was now a bruised electric charcoal, choked by the descending silhouettes of 15 Iron Void heavy assault dropships. They looked like jagged teeth tearing through the atmosphere, trailing plumes of toxic orange propellant. Vane Cordal stood on the uppermost observation deck of the harmonic spire. his silhouette framed by a world that was rapidly losing its serenity. He wasn't wearing his matte black security plating anymore. That had been shredded in the tunnels. Instead, he was encased in a hybrid suit. The inner layers were woven from the spire's own reactive fibers, and the outer plates were scavenged pieces of sentinel armor, hastily bolted together with industrial rivets. He looked like a junkyard god of war, a chaotic blend of organic crystal and cold utilitarian steel. "Check 6, kid," Vane muttered, not turning around as he sensed a small presence behind him. Eerie stepped onto the balcony. The white light in her eyes had settled into a steady, glowing amber, matching the new hue of the palace walls. She carried a heavy satchel filled with resonance capsules, Vane's improvised version of sonic grenades. "The sky is heavy, Vane," she said, her filaments twitching as the first sonic boom of an entering ship rumbled across the clouds. "It sounds like the void is hungry." "The void is always hungry, Irie. That's why it's called the void," Vane said, adjusting the sights on a massive, long-range rail gun he had mounted to the balcony's railing. The weapon was a relic from his days in the Iron Void, a prototype that threw tungsten slugs at 5% the speed of light. He had modified it to feed off the spire's central resonance core. But today it's going to get a mouthful of something it didn't count on. "You ready for your part?" Irie nodded, her face set in a mask of determination that was far too old for a 7-year-old child. "I am the drummer. I hold the beat." "That's right. If the palace starts to falter, you sing the thump-thump. Don't worry about the lyrics. Just keep the rhythm steady. If the beat breaks, the railguns lose power, and then we're real-world foobar." Vane tapped his comms. "Sovereign, you in position?" Ilaravin's voice came through, crisp and shivering with a new kind of intensity. "The sentinels are arranged in the secondary ring, Cordell. We have abandoned the traditional hymns. My people they are humming the cadence of the earth dogs. It feels strange. It feels violent." "It's not violent, Ilara. It's protective," Vane said, his gaze fixed on the lead dropship. "There's a difference. Now cut the lights in the lower 3 tiers. I want them thinking we're out of juice." The spire responded instantly. The lower half of the massive structure went dark, the glowing crystals fading into a deceptive gloom. Vane knew the tactics of the Iron Void better than he knew his own face. They were efficient, cold, and utterly reliant on sensor data. If they thought the spire was dying, they would go for a high-speed insertion, grouping their ships for a coordinated breach. It was exactly what he wanted them to do. "Here they come," Vane whispered. The 15 drop ships flared their retro rockets, slowing as they approached the spire's midsection. They were coming in hot, their black hulls gleaming with the light of Orosvel's twin suns. Vane could see the corporate logos on their wings, the interlocking gears of the Iron Void. His old life was literally falling out of the sky to kill his new one. "Vane," Eerie asked, her hand ghosting near his scarred forearm, "are they your family too?" The question felt like a kinetic slug to the chest. Vane gripped the handles of the railgun until the metal groaned. "No, kid. They're just the people I used to work for. There's a big difference between a payroll and a family. You'll learn that today." The lead ship crossed the 2-kilometer mark. Vane's HUD flared green. He didn't pull the trigger. He waited until they were within 1,200 meters, close enough to see the thermal venting on their engines. "Now, Irie, give him the base." Irie closed her eyes and placed her hands on the living floor. She didn't scream. She hummed, a deep chest-rattling sound that resonated through the very bones of the spire. The amber walls began to pulse with a fierce, rhythmic orange light. The railgun in Vane's hands roared. The tungsten slug vanished into a blur of hyper-accelerated motion, punching through the lead dropship's nose and exiting out the rear engine block. The ship didn't just explode, it shattered into 1,000,000 pieces of burning debris. "One down," Vane growled, swinging the heavy weapon toward the second ship. 14 to go. Let's make them regret the overtime." The Iron Void wasn't prepared for a counter-offensive that used the architecture as a power source. They panicked, their tight formations scattering as the spire erupted into a storm of defensive fire. But Vane knew this was just the prologue. The mercs would adapt. They would realize that the man leading the defense was one of their own, and then they would stop playing by the book. "Vane, another group is coming from the shadow side." Ilaravin's voice was frantic. "They have bypassed the railguns." "I see 'em." Vane said, his heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat. They're going for the service vents. Erie, stay here. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me or your mother, you use those capsules and you run to the core. You hear me? Erie looked at him, her filaments glowing with a fierce, protective light. I will not run, Vane. I am LIA. Supern. Vane paused, a lump forming in his throat. He reached out and ruffled her hair, a gesture that felt more natural than anything he'd ever done with a rifle. Yeah, you are. But even LIA soldiers have to follow orders. Stay frosty, kid. He turned and sprinted toward the service elevators, his scavenged armor clattering with every step. He had spent 38 years running away from things, from responsibility, from grief, from the ghosts of his squad. But as he plunged into the dark, vibrating heart of the spire, Vane Cordell realized he wasn't running anymore. He was standing his ground. He was home. The service corridor was a slaughterhouse of sound. 3 Iron Void breach teams had managed to burn through the outer membranes, and they were moving with the grim efficiency of professional exterminators. They used smoke grenades that didn't just obscure vision, but actively absorbed the spire's resonance, creating pockets of dead silence that felt like a physical weight. Vane moved through the gray fog, his HUD switched to thermal. He was low on ammo, his sidearm had 4 rounds left, and his combat knife was notched. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of corporate combat boots, a sound he had once been a part of, now the herald of his destruction. Contact! 3 bogeys! 10 meters! Vane barked into his internal comms, though there was nobody left to hear him on this frequency. He lunged through the smoke, catching the first merc with a shoulder charge that sent them flying into a jagged crystal outcrop. He didn't stop to finish them. He spun, his boot connecting with the second merc's helmet, the visor cracking with a satisfying pop. The third merc, a veteran with a heavy-duty shredder cannon, leveled the weapon at Vane's chest. Vane? Is that you, Cordell? The merc's voice was distorted by their helmet, but Vane recognized the cadence. It was Miller, a man he had shared 100 foxholes with. What the hell are you doing, man? This planet is a write-off. Step aside and let us finish the job. We can still get you out of here. Vane stood in the center of the corridor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Can't do that, Miller. I've got a prior engagement. For a bunch of singing rocks and a half-breed kid? Miller's voice was full of genuine confusion. The Void is offering a triple bonus for this hit. Think about the credits, Vane. You could retire to the core systems. I'm already retired, Miller, Vane said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low growl. I'm a father now, and in my house we don't like uninvited guests. Miller sighed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Always wear a head case, Cordell. Sad to see you go out like this. The shredder cannon roared, a hail of razor-sharp flechettes tearing through the air. Vane dived behind a shifting crystal pillar, the impact of the shards spraying him with a fine mist of dust. He felt a sharp, burning pain in his shoulder, but he ignored it. He had to get past them. He had to get to the core before they realized it was the palace's only weak point. Erie, you still with me? Vane hissed into his comms. I am here, Vane. Her voice was tiny, muffled by the sound of explosions above. The palace it is shaking. It is crying for you. Tell it to hold on. I'm coming. Vane looked at the pile of resonance capsules he had left. He had one, a high-frequency burst designed to destabilize organic tissue. It was a suicide weapon at this range. He looked at the mercs, then at the direction of the royal quarters. He thought about Erie's laughter, the way she had looked at him when he told her about the dogs. He thought about Sovereign Alara Vin, a woman who had learned to be a mother in the middle of a war. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had finally found something he couldn't walk away from. Hey, Miller. Vane yelled, stepping out from behind the pillar. You remember what we used to say back in the 7th Division? Miller paused, his cannon humming. What's that? If you can't win the song, break the instruments. Vane triggered the resonance capsule and threw it at the ceiling. The explosion wasn't fire and smoke. It was a wall of pure, unfiltered vibration. The ceiling of the corridor didn't collapse. It shattered into 1,000,000 vibrating needles that rained down on the breach team. The merc's armor, designed to resist heat and kinetic impact, was useless against a frequency that turned their own bones into tuning forks. They collapsed, their internal systems overloaded, their bodies shaking in a terrifying, rhythmic seizure. Vane was thrown backward by the blast, his vision turning into a kaleidoscopic mess of white and crimson. He felt his ribs crack, his scavenged armor shattering under the pressure. He hit the floor hard, the air driven from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, the silence of the corridor ringing in his ears. He could feel the spire humming beneath him, not an angry hum, but a soft, grieving vibration. It was the sound of a world that was losing its protector. Vane! Erie's voice was a whisper in his ear. He coughed, a spray of blood hitting the inside of his cracked visor. Still here, kid. Just taking a 5-minute break. The soldiers are at the door, Vane, she said, and for the first time her voice was full of pure, unadulterated terror. They are burning the walls. Mommy is trying to hold them, but her song is fading. Vane felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity. The pain didn't vanish, but it retreated behind a wall of sheer, stubborn will. He pushed himself up, his limbs feeling like they were made of lead. He had to get to them. He had to. He stumbled toward the elevator, his vision blurring. He reached the royal quarters just as the final breach team blew the doors. 4 mercs, including the commander of the Iron Void contingent, a man known only as the Eraser, stepped into the room. Ilaravin stood in front of Irie, her filaments glowing with a dying, pale light. She was holding a shard of crystal, her eyes full of a fierce, desperate courage. "Step away from the asset, Sovereign," the Eraser said, his voice a cold, mechanical rasp. "The Iron Void does not leave witnesses." "She is my daughter," Ilaravin said, her voice steady despite the shaking of her hands. "And you will have to kill me first." "That is the plan," the Eraser said, raising a high-yield plasma pistol. "Hey, boss man!" The merc spun around. Vane Cordell stood in the doorway, his armor hanging in rags, his face a mask of blood and grit. He was holding a small black box, the remote detonator for the Spire's emergency resonance core. "Cordell," the Eraser hissed, "you're still breathing? I'll have to dock Miller's pay." "Miller's dead," Vane said, his thumb hovering over the red button. "And you're about 30 seconds away from joining him. This box is wired to the core. You pull that trigger, and I pull this one. Oros Vel becomes a supernova, and the Iron Void loses their entire investment. How's that for a sit rep?" The Eraser paused, his eyes flickering to the detonator. He was a professional. He knew a dead man's switch when he saw one. And he knew Vane Cordell. "You're bluffing, Vane," the Eraser said, though his hand wavered. "You wouldn't kill the girl." "I'm not killing her," Vane said, his eyes meeting Erie's for a fleeting, beautiful second. "I'm giving her a choice, and she chooses to be free. Right, kid?" Irie looked at Vane, then at the detonator. She stepped forward past her mother and stood beside him. She took his hand, her small fingers warm against his cold, scarred skin. "We choose to be LIA, she said, her voice ringing through the room with the power of 1,000 suns. The spire responded. It didn't explode. It sang. The amber light in the walls turned into a blinding, incandescent white. The resonance core didn't detonate. It broadcast a frequency so pure, so powerful, that it short-circuited every piece of Iron Void technology within 5 kilometers. The mercs' armor locked up, their weapons turned into useless lumps of metal, and their dropships in the sky began to fall like dead birds. The Eraser looked at his useless pistol, then at Vane. "What? What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Vane said, his legs finally giving out as the white light began to fade. "The palace just decided you weren't on the guest list." The mercs were rounded up by the remaining Erosian sentinels, their silence bombs and shredder cannons tossed into the scrap heaps of history. The siege was over. The Iron Void had been broken, not by a better weapon, but by a better story. Vane slumped against the wall, Irie still holding his hand. Ilaravin knelt beside him, her hands glowing with a soft, healing light. But Vane shook his head. "Save it! For the spire," he gasped. I'm good." "Vane," Irie whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You stayed." "I told you, kid," Vane said, his eyes closing as the warmth of the palace settled into his bones. "In this family, we always stay." As the first light of the next morning began to creep over the horizon of Oros Vel, The harmonic spire didn't look like a palace anymore. It looked like a fortress, scarred, battered, and standing taller than it ever had before. It wasn't perfect. It was a mess of amber light and jagged crystal, a testament to a war that had been won by a man who had forgotten how to sing and a girl who had taught him how to scream. Vane Cordell didn't wake up for 3 days, but when he did, he didn't find a hospital bed or a suspension field. He found a small, furry creature sitting on his chest, licking his face with a wet, enthusiastic tongue. "What the?" Vane sputtered, pushing the creature aside. "It is a dog, Vane," Irie shouted, jumping onto the bed. "The Sovereign ordered the biological fabricators to make one from your stories. He smells like wet grass, and he eats the furniture." Vane looked at the dog, a golden, floppy-eared mess of fur that was currently trying to chew on his newly repaired boot. He looked at Irie, then at Alaravin, who was standing in the doorway with a tray of actual hot coffee. He laughed. It was a loud, ugly, wonderful sound that made the walls of the palace ripple in a frantic, joyous zigzag. "Well," Vane said, reaching out to scratch the dog behind the ears, "I guess we'd better get started on those railguns. I have a feeling the neighbors are going to be complaining about the noise." The universe had shifted, not with a bang, but with a choice. And as the spire sang its new, discordant, beautiful song, Vane Cordell realized that he wasn't a soldier of fortune anymore. He was a father, and that was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The silence that settled over Oros Vel in the days following the siege was unlike any silence Vane Cordell had ever known. It wasn't the sterile, pressurized quiet of a vacuum, nor was it the oppressive, manufactured dampening of a silencer bomb. It was a living silence, heavy with the weight of things newly understood and old structures finally crumbling. Vane sat on the edge of a balcony 300 meters above the primary gardens, watching the reconstruction droids, small, hovering orbs of golden light, stitch the shattered crystal of the lower galleries back together. His ribs were still taped, and every breath felt like a dull knife was being dragged across his lungs. But he refused the suspension fields this time. He wanted to feel the ground. He wanted to feel the ache. It was a reminder that he was still anchored to the world, and that the world hadn't shaken him off yet. His armor was gone, replaced by a simple, charcoal-colored tunic provided by the palace weavers. It felt disturbingly soft against his skin. To his left, Barnaby, the biological fabrication that Irie insisted on calling a dog, was currently locked in a fierce battle with Vane's discarded combat boot. The creature was a chaotic mess of golden fur and clumsy paws, a living testament to how much Vane's stories had infected the local imagination. "Give it a rest, Barnaby," Vane muttered, his voice still a jagged rasp. "That boot's seen more combat than you've seen dinner bowls. It's tough leather." The dog responded by growling playfully and wagging a tail that was slightly too long for its body, a minor glitch in the fabrication process that Irie found hilarious. "You are talking to the beast again," a voice observed. Vane didn't need to look. The cadence was unmistakably Alaravin's, though the sharp, orchestral authority in her tone had been replaced by something softer, more rhythmic. She walked to the edge of the balcony, her filaments glowing with a steady, warm amber light. She was no longer dressed in the rigid ceremonial robes of the Sovereign, but in a simple wrap of translucent silk. "He's a good listener," Vane said, patting the stone beside him. "Better than most of the brass I've served under." Ilaravin sat, her movements lacking the practiced perfection of the old days. She looked out at the horizon, where the twin suns were beginning to dip, painting the sky in colors that were no longer just lavender, but orange, red, and a deep earthy brown. "The High Cantor has spent the last 48 hours in the Vault of Echoes," she said quietly. "He is not purging the discordance. He is recording it. He calls it the human verse. He believes that Oros Vel has been holding its breath for 10,000 years, and you are the one who finally made us exhale." Vane snorted. "I just kicked a door down, Alara. That's what I do. I'm a breacher. I don't usually stick around to see what's inside." "And yet here you are," she said, her filaments flickering with a soft, knowing light. "The Iron Void has officially withdrawn its claim on this sector. The cost of the siege was too high for their shareholders to justify. They have labeled this world economically non-viable due to unpredictable environmental hazards. Unpredictable environmental hazards, Vane repeated, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I like that. It's got a nice ring to it. They will not come back, Vane. But the galaxy is watching now. They have seen a world of glass and song defy the most powerful mercenary corporation in the void. They are confused. They are afraid. And some are curious. Curious is dangerous, Vane warned, his merc instincts flaring. Curious means they'll send scouts. Then they'll send diplomats. Then they'll send advisors. You're going to need to keep the volume up if you want to keep them at bay. We will, she said, and for the first time she reached out and placed her hand on his scarred forearm. Her skin felt like cool velvet. But we cannot do it alone. The spire is changing, Vane. It is growing warmer. It is responding to emotions it once suppressed. It is no longer a perfect temple. It is becoming a home. And a home requires a protector who understands the value of the mess. Vane looked away, watching Irie in the distance as she ran through the gardens with a group of sentinel children. They weren't singing hymns. They were playing a game of tag, their laughter echoing through the crystal trees. It was a beautiful, chaotic sound. I'm a 38-year-old jarhead with a bad knee and enough trauma to sink a cruiser, Ilara. I'm not exactly Father of the Year material. Irie does not want a hero from a storybook, Vane. She wants the man who stayed. She wants the man who taught her that she is allowed to be loud. My people have spent centuries choosing our leaders by the purity of their song. But I have realized that purity is just another word for emptiness. We choose you because you are full of scars, full of stories, and full of a fierce, stubborn love that we did not know was possible. Vane felt the old walls around his heart begin to buckle. He had spent his whole life avoiding this moment, the moment where he had to stop moving and start existing. He had defined himself by the missions he accepted and the targets he eliminated. He was a tool of the void. But here, in this place that shouldn't make sense to him, he felt a resonance that had nothing to do with technology. I don't know how to do this, Vane whispered. None of us do, Ilara said, her hand squeezing his arm. That is the point. We will find the rhythm together. The next morning, the formal recognition began. It wasn't a trial, and it wasn't an audience. It was a gathering of the people in the Great Heart. Thousands of Erotians stood in the tiered galleries, their filaments glowing with 100 different colors. The spire was humming, but it wasn't the high-pitched whine of the past. It was a deep, resonant thrum that felt like a warm embrace. Vane stood in the center of the chamber, his hands clasped behind his back. Irie was beside him, wearing a tunic that matched his. She was holding Barnaby by a leash made of woven light, the dog occasionally barking at his own shadow. High Cantor Malveth stepped forward. He looked older, his robes no longer made of obsidian, but of a soft gray fabric that moved like smoke. He didn't carry a staff. He carried a small crystalline sphere that contained a single flickering ember of orange light. Vane Cordell, the Cantor began, his voice echoing through the chamber. You arrived as a discordance, a soldier of the void, bound by contract and coin. You saw our world as a mission, and our people as assets to be guarded. Vane nodded slowly. That's the sit-rep. But in the hour of our silence, when the harmony failed and the dark descended, you did not behave as a soldier. You behaved as a father. You did not protect the girl because of a contract. You protected her because she was yours. You taught her that the scream is as sacred as the song, and that the dirt is as beautiful as the light. The Cantor turned to the assembly. The spire has updated its archives. The old laws of lineage and blood have been found. Insufficient. We have learned that a family is not grown from the ground, but chosen in the fire. We have learned that the strongest bond is not the one we are born with, but the one we stay for. The Cantor turned back to Vane. Irivin has chosen you. The Sovereign has confirmed you. The spire has accepted you. Do you, Vane Cordell, choose to remain? Do you choose to be the father to this child and the protector of this discord? The silence that followed was absolute. Thousands of eyes were on the human soldier. Vane looked at Irie. She was watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She wasn't asking him to be perfect. She was just asking him to be there. Vane took a deep breath. He thought about the iron void, the credits, the empty bars, and the endless, lonely nights in the dark. He thought about the man he used to be and the man he was becoming. "I'm staying," Vane said, his voice firm and clear. "I'm staying until the last note falls." The spire erupted. It wasn't a cheer, but a surge of resonance that turned the white walls into a riot of orange and gold. The people hummed a melody that was jagged, joyous, and utterly human. It was the sound of a world finally coming alive. 1 year had passed since the day the Iron Void dropships fell from the sky, and the Oros Vel that Vane Cordell walked through now was a place of beautiful, intentional chaos. Vane stood in the center of the main training grounds, located in the shadows of the western spires. He was wearing a new suit of armor, designed by the palace engineers to work with his human physiology rather than against it. It was matte black, yes, but it was etched with glowing amber lines that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He didn't look like a shadow anymore. He looked like a spark. "Again!" Vane barked, his voice carrying across the field. "I want to see the rotation. If the shield fails, you don't stand there singing about it. You move. Use the architecture. The spire is your squad mate, not your scenery." A group of 50 Erosian sentinels shifted their stance. They were no longer the stiff, ethereal statues of the past. They were lean, focused, and moving with a rhythmic aggression that was distinctly Cordelian. They didn't carry tuning forks. They carried resonance rifles and kinetic shields. They were the first discordant division, the elite protectors of the spire. To his right, Eerie sat on a low wall, her feet dangling. She was 8 years old now, her filaments longer and glowing with a constant, confident gold. She was holding a data pad, recording the performance of the sentinels. Beside her, Barnaby was asleep in a patch of sunlight, his long tail occasionally twitching in a dream of chasing cosmic squirrels. "They are getting better, Vane," Irie called out. "The sergeant in the third row is finally hitting the right beat." "He's still a half-second slow on the draw, Irie," Vane countered, walking over to her. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a rag. "In a real scrap, a half-second is the difference between a victory and a KIA. You always say that, because it's always true. Survival is about the details, kid. You can have the best song in the galaxy, but if you don't have the boots to back it up, nobody's going to hear the encore." Eerie jumped down from the wall and took his hand. "The High Cantor says the new expansion to the Western Wing is almost finished. He wants to know if you want the walls to be loud or quiet." Vane smiled, looking up at the spire. It was no longer a perfect translucent needle. It had grown new sections that were rougher, more textured, reflecting the personality of its new residents. There were areas where the walls felt like wood, and areas where the light was as warm as a hearth fire. "Tell him I want them to be honest," Vane said. "If the people are happy, let the walls be bright. If they're mourning, let them be dim. We're done pretending everything is perfect." They walked together toward the royal galleries, passing through corridors that opened with a friendly, rhythmic hum as they approached. Vane noticed a group of Erosian citizens sitting in a circle, telling stories. This was a new development. Before Vane, they only communicated in abstract harmonies. Now they were learning the power of the narrative. They were talking about their lives, their fears, and their hopes for the future. As they reached the upper balcony, Sovereign Alaravan was waiting for them. She looked at Vane, her expression one of deep, abiding peace. "The diplomatic fleet from the Vega system has arrived," she said. "They are requesting an audience. They say they have heard of a world where the music has teeth." Vane laughed, leaning against the railing. "Teeth, huh? I like that. Tell them the drummer is busy, but we can squeeze them in for a sound check tomorrow." Ilaravan smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. For a moment, the three of them stood there, the soldier, the sovereign, and the child, looking out over a world that had been saved by a scream. Vane looked at the stars, which were beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. He thought about the thousands of light years he had traveled, the hundreds of battles he had fought, and the millions of credits he had earned and spent. He thought about the cold, empty silence of the void that had once been his only home. He realized then that the most important mission of his life hadn't been the one he was paid for. It was the one he had chosen. He had been assigned to the spire, a warning of the darkness. But in the end, the spire had been assigned to him. It had shown him that even the most broken tool can find a purpose, and even the most discordant soul can find a family. I spent a long time thinking that life was just a series of contracts. You show up, you do the job, you get paid, and you move on to the next sector. I thought that keeping my distance was the only way to stay sharp, that being alone was the only way to be safe. I treated my heart like a piece of gear that had been discontinued, something to be patched up with cheap tape and ignored until it finally seized up for good. But Oros Velo, this place broke every rule I had. It taught me that perfection is a lie we tell ourselves, so we don't have to deal with the truth of our own mess. It taught me that the loudest sound in the universe isn't an explosion or a gunshot, but the sound of a child laughing when she finally feels safe. I used to think that being a soldier was about how many people you could stop. Now I know that being a father is about how many people you're willing to start for. I've traded my matte black solitude for a house made of singing glass and a dog that eats my boots, and I wouldn't trade it back for all the credits in the Corps. I found out that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, one jagged, discordant, beautiful note at a time. I'm not just a guardian anymore. I'm home. I spent my entire life looking for a reason to stay, only to realize I was the one who had to make that reason. I used to think I was just a discordant note in a perfect world, but it turns out the world just needed someone to change the key. I wonder, in your own life, have you ever felt like you didn't belong to the story you were born into? Have you ever had to choose your own family or find your own rhythm when the world's music didn't fit you? What was the moment you realized that your discord was actually the thing that made you real? Vane reached down and unlatched Barnaby's leash, letting the dog run free toward a group of laughing children. He took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling the steady rhythmic thump of the palace beneath his feet. And finally, for the first time in 38 years, he let out a long, peaceful exhale. The suns of Oros Vel dipped below the horizon, and as the first stars appeared, the spire began to sing, a new, loud, and wonderfully messy song.